The average new soldier in the U.S. Army makes around $10 an hour. That's not good enough. If we want to find and retain the best possible soldiers, it starts with pay. So that's what I'm going to talk about first, but I'm also going to present 3 other changes that don't get as much attention, but they should. It's not that better potential soldiers are all attracted to a job with more pay. It's that higher pay increases the pool of those that are interested at all. So let's say the Army needs 20,000 new soldiers next year, and they're drawing from 200,000 that have shown any level of interest. We're going to end up taking on or about the top 10% of that number. Increasing pay should open up the Army to more folks as a viable path. So let's say that number jumps to 300,000 interested. Now those 20,000 coming in are the top 6%. Better overall, not rocket science. Personal opinion, I think pay is an easy one that we make overly complicated in the military. For example here, I'm going to use a private first class in the U.S. Army. So generally speaking, that's someone pretty early in their military career and at a rank that is well within reach of anyone who enlists. And we're going to use a 2+ year time in service. That'll be important here in a second. Again, vast majority of enlistments are greater than 2 years, so this is a rank and a time in service realistic to most. So pulling up the Army pay tables here, which are all online, and I'll link them in the description below if you want to dig into them further. You won't see private first class on this chart. Here we use pay grades, E for enlisted, O for officer, and WO for warrant officer. For most of these, they align 1-to-1. Like in the Army, all O3s are captains, but in some cases like E8, you'll have both first sergeant and master sergeant. Same pay, different rank and responsibilities. Anyways, using the chart, you can see that an E3 with more than 2 years in service is making $2,402 pre-tax per month for base pay. Now it's time for some comparisons. Someone making $10 an hour working 40-hour weeks will pull in $1,600 in a 4-week month, and someone making $15 an hour is at $2,400 per month. So a normal job at $15 an hour equals the same pay as going through basic, getting yelled at, waking up early, and working well over 40-hour weeks. The Army's going to be a hard sell with that data. I mean, if we're being honest, most soldiers put in north of 60 hours per week if we average it out over the course of a year. They're coming in, around 6 a.m., maybe get an hour for lunch, and go home around 5 p.m. every day. That's 10-hour days, 5 days a week, plus the pretty regular night and weekend responsibilities. And now is a good time to check in on the comments because I'm sure you're going to hear plenty of folks laughing at the 60-hour week figure I'm even using here. There are plenty of units that at times will blow right past that figure. Bottom line, it's not a 40-hour per week job, and it's not even close. So now if we're trying to break out an hourly wage based on 60-hour weeks, we're back near $10 an hour for a private first class. That was competitive at a time, but not anymore, and I think it changed faster than the Army can keep up. My wife and I run a small business here in Tennessee, and when we opened, average wage for the position we were hiring was $9.50 an hour. We offered $10 and got a bunch of solid applicants, but now, 2 years on, we can't get people to even apply for less than $15 an hour. So if money is someone's primary motivator for joining, that's a problem for the Army. It's just too easy to find a comparable salary somewhere else that doesn't come with the added stress and risks. Now, if we really step back and include the total picture, I do personally still think the Army is a good option for the right people. I mean, that PFC at the 2-year mark has housing, meals, healthcare, and dental all paid for. So while $2,402 per month is their take-home pay, there's some pretty big expenses that the Army is taking on. I just don't know that your average 17 to 19-year-old kid are weighing all of that together. When people say pay, they're talking about cash in their account. And like I said earlier, when the Army includes all these different benefits and bonuses into the overall compensation, I think we're making it more complicated than it needs to be. Real quick, no, someone should not be spending a career as a private first class. That's an entry-level job. That's why I'm comparing it with entry-level jobs out in the civilian sector. Moving past these gets kind of complicated. Like, how do you compare a sergeant first class salary to a mid-career position out in the civilian sector? Lots and lots of variation between those two. That portion later in the career gets into making the experience in the Army better, which is what my next few points get to, but let's finish up with pay here. But how do we make this better? I mean, increased pay in line with inflation. Let's start there. Inflation last year was around 8%, while the Army base pay went up 4.6%. Solid. But if we're going to compete on pay, I'd argue it should have gone up to 9% to outpace inflation. I'd need an economist to come in and give me all the ins and outs as to why that won't work, but I'll say that this 4.6% bump made the Army less attractive of an option this year, and that's a problem. Next up on the Preston list of things to make the Army better for everyone, make it easier for soldiers to change jobs. In the Army, we have something called Military Occupational Specialties, or MOS. Infantrymen is 11 Bravo, cannon crew members 13 Bravo, combat medic 68 Whiskey, and so on and so forth. These are specific jobs that new soldiers are trained on right after basic training, and they generally stay doing those jobs their entire career. But here's the problem. You have no idea if you'll actually like that job when you sign your initial contract. The information about these jobs is out there, especially with social media, but it's still a pretty big gamble. I mean, if you're coming from being a civilian your entire life, there are no jobs you can look to and think, yeah, it'll be just like that, just in the military. I mean, maybe some unique exceptions, but for the majority of the force, you're entering a new world in terms of how things are done, the structure, the expectations, etc. I wish there was a statistic out there of how many people leave the Army because they don't like their specific job. It's got to be hard to measure because the idea of changing MOSs tends to be so daunting that most soldiers and officers just settle in. This is my life now. There are programs to change MOS on the enlisted side and a branch transfer on the officer side, but it's not that simple, or at the very least, it could be a lot easier. The standard process now is that you usually have to go back through some sort of modified advanced individual training for that specific skill set. It's usually a few months, but even getting approved to do that can be a pretty serious challenge. So let's look at a way to clear the path for soldiers to make that jump earlier in their career. Maybe there's a window open for the first 2 to 3 years of your contract where soldiers can opt into available MOSs pending the completion of that specific AIT. Think about it. A combat medic shows up to a unit wanting to be like Desmond Doss at Hacksaw Ridge, only to find out he's running sick call at a clinic on a training base. So why not let them make that call early? Jump over to an MOS that is in need of soldiers and they can continue their career there. Now, to be clear, there is a cost here that I can't dial in exactly. It costs money to send someone back through training, and I don't know how that compares to the cost of retaining a soldier that otherwise may have left. We're going to need the big brains to dive in on that one. Keeping with this theme of giving soldiers more choices, let's find a way to let brand new soldiers coming out of basic training or AIT to choose their first duty location. I think we underestimate how impactful that can actually be on someone's life. We already do something kind of like this at West Point. After choosing their branch like artillery or aviation, cadets are broken down into those branch groups where they're presented with slots available for various posts. There might be, 2 spots to Hawaii, 5 to Fort Bragg, and 16 to Fort Riley. Cadets make their picks by class rank based on what's available when it's their turn. Even if you don't get exactly what you want, there's a feeling of choosing your own path that's empowering, especially that early in your career. Think about how many young 18-year-old soldiers away from friends and family for the first time would choose a base where they could travel home on the occasional long weekend. That sort of stability for some means the world and could be the difference between somebody hating the Army because they never see their loved ones or loving it because they have the support structure they need. Next up, once they're at that first duty location, stop moving them so often. Most soldiers move to a new location every 2 to 3 years, and for anyone who's moved before, you know how stressful that is. I mean, the Army helps where they can, but every few years it's updating all sorts of records, forwarding your mail, packing, unpacking, losing things in the move, sending out new addresses to family and friends, and so much more. It's a headache. Even for a single soldier with no family, that's a lot to deal with, but the added stress for a spouse and children, it's significant. I mean, this is one of the primary reasons I left active duty when I did. My wife and I were looking to start a life together, and with her career, she just couldn't move every 2 years. And on top of that, I had no idea where my next duty assignment would be. So you almost have to think about prioritizing the Army over your family, and that's a risky move for the Army in a lot of ways. We already put a lot of stress on our soldiers at work. We don't need to add to it on the home front. Forcing families to find a new support structure and integrate into a new community every 2 years is a recipe for disaster. For some outgoing extrovert types, it's great, but for others, it can slowly isolate them from the places and the people where they felt the most comfortable and safe. Now, the argument for this is that rotating in new soldiers brings in new ideas and new personalities over time. It keeps an organization from kind of settling in with bad habits and can allow for the sharing of ideas and leadership all across the force. And overall, I think that's a good thing, and it does keep us flexible, but there are other ways that we can do that. Rather than a permanent change of station from one base to another, let's keep that 2 to 3 year move window, but do it locally. I mean, in a lot of cases, a move between brigades in the same division may as well be another post. There's plenty of room just down the road to bring in new ideas and a change in leadership. Then we can shift the actual moves between posts, or PCS moves, to every 5 to 6 years. That's a lot of added stability for the family and saves the Army some money. In 2020, the last year I could find the data on this, the active component of the U.S. Army spent $1.7 billion on these PCS moves. They do happen in the Guard and Reserves as well, but that's a rounding error compared to the active force. So go twice as long between PCS moves, and it's $800 million saved, which isn't exactly the reason I'm bringing this up, but, added benefit. The last piece I have is something that the Army has gotten better with over time, but we still have a long way to go. Let's start guiding folks through their transition to the civilian sector from day one. That transition period is hard. I struggled with it, and I think it's safe to say that most of my friends and soldiers had a rough time as well. There's a lot to this challenge, and it's not something we're going to resolve in a course or with a speaker coming in, but we can get ahead of it more than we are. All soldiers leave the Army. That's what is supposed to happen. We're not even hoping to retain all soldiers for 20 years. I mean, the Army is built to need a lot of folks at the lower ranks and very few at the top. So even if recruiting and retention are perfect, that's a lot of people leaving the service every single year. For the vast majority of people that serve, the Army is a stepping stone. So let's recognize that and use our time with these soldiers to make it a positive experience for them in the long term. It's in all of our best interest that soldiers leave the Army and continue to serve as a positive influence for their families, their communities, and their country. This doesn't come down to a program on the way out the door or mandatory classes added to the schedule. It's more a mindset shift within Army leadership. We're so focused on building our current team and explaining to soldiers, especially the top performers, why they should stay in uniform. But to get the best out of our people now, they need to know we actually care about them. One way to do that is to start having the conversation early about, hey, what are you going to do when the day comes that you get out of the Army? Rather than be hyper-focused on exclusively what will help the soldier's military career, leaders can spend more time on kind of developing the whole person, help them set conditions for their next phase, whether it's in 1 year or 20. The thing here is that good leaders do genuinely care and want the best for their people, but sometimes can be a little constrained with what they can offer in terms of development. It's a little counterintuitive, but I think the way to keep quality soldiers in uniform isn't to pressure them into staying, but to have open conversations with them early on about what's best for them as individuals. Sometimes that's the Army, sometimes it isn't. But making that connection and helping them become better people, not just better soldiers, is a win for both parties long term. I don't think any of these are too extreme or impossible to pull off, but they're enough of a change to where it certainly won't be fast. The Army and the military as a whole is notoriously slow at rolling out changes, and it can be so challenging to push change forward that most service members will hear these points and think, sure, that'd be nice, but no way it'll happen. That's a problem. If we have things that can improve the lives and careers of our people, but the idea of implementing them sounds like a fantasy, something needs addressing. Our organization thrives on adapting and overcoming challenges while you're getting shot at. I think the same group of people is probably capable of making administrative changes from an office. That is, if people truly are as important as we say they are. But that's all I got for now. I'll see y'all next time.